Program here at the Baker Center. Welcome. If this is your first time to the Baker Center, I would encourage you to sign up to our mailing list. We do these events pretty frequently. So if you've not been to these things before, this is a chance to talk about an energy environmental policy issue in a safe space where we're just talking about the various perspectives around these energy and policy issues. If you are watching online, you should be able to toggle. So if you're seeing something that isn't two guys on a stage, you should be able to toggle your view on your device to see a different camera view. Sometimes there are some issues with seeing inside the auditorium versus seeing something else. But I'm really excited about our talk today. It's on a topic that I'm really interested in. I love talking about technology issues as much as the next person. What I really enjoy talking about is how those technologies roll out. So who's going to be paying for them? Who's going to adopt them? When are we going to adopt them? And what types of issues might come up when we adopt them? So we've framed this whole discussion today around hastening the clean energy technology without compromising several things: reliability, affordability, and the environment. And we've framed this around this concept of move fast and break things. Now, who's heard that concept before? So fairly common concept from the engineering and science areas. In economics, we have another term for it called creative destruction, but it's that general notion that in a competitive environment, you have to move quickly, you have to make mistakes, you have to quickly learn from those mistakes, and you've got to move on. And that process creates lots of efficiencies and lots of new innovations. That's the world we're in with climate change, right? But moving fast can also have a negative side effect of creating unintended consequences. So to cover this topic today, we have Mike Boots, who is the Executive Vice President of Breakthrough Energy, who is a perfect person to talk about this. And so, Mike, you want to take a bit to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about what Breakthrough Energy does? There's lots of people working in this space. What makes Breakthrough Energy unique to think about this challenge?
Sure. Thanks for having me here, first of all. It's nice to see you all. I am the Executive Vice President at a thing called Breakthrough Energy, which is an organization that tries to accelerate the adoption of emerging technologies that help us get to net zero through a whole variety of different strategies. Some of that involves private investment, trying to make some bets on the range of technologies across the economy that we think are likely to move the needle most in terms of decarbonizing all of the different sources of emissions. Some of that involves bringing philanthropic dollars to the game, where we expect no return on those dollars, but where they might be highest leverage in trying to move that needle. And then in all cases, trying to use policy, public policy and politics to help change the dynamics on the likelihood of those technologies both getting grounded in a market and being able to scale at the scale that we need them to. So I manage a group of people who are thinking about the policy work both here in the US and in Europe, and then a set of folks who are leading all of our partnerships with corporations, big and small, a set of our portfolio companies that are part of our venture fund, and a set of philanthropic partners across the foundation and philanthropic community who are also putting money into those places.
So you've tackled this problem from a number of different perspectives. You were talking earlier today how you've spent time in government, you've spent time in the private sector. You've seen it from a lot of different angles. So can you give us an example of perhaps where this move fast and break things strategy has paid off in terms of a fantastic innovation, and maybe where it's maybe gotten in the way or caused some unintended harm?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to talk about it in that frame of move fast and break things. In some ways, the fast part of that is super relative because government is not a place known for being super fast, right? So, and yet, as Charles said earlier, on this issue of climate and clean energy, the pace at which we do this work is super critical. So I have spent time before coming to this job in government. I led an office in the White House dealing with environmental and energy policy. And I was coming in at a time in that role when the US government created something called ARPA-E, which is a part of the government that is investing in relatively risky technology investments, different than how the Department of Energy or any other part of the U.S. government invests in those sorts of things. And so it was interesting to watch the culture. That place is definitely founded on this principle, right? That you come in and you don't make people go through the usual long process that it takes to get federal money. You streamline that. You give them some set of money in a relatively long leash, but then you actively monitor their technology milestones along that front. And so it was super interesting to watch how RPE was able to incentivize technology advancements, whether that was in the nuclear space or hydrogen or storage, in ways that the rest of DOE, even though they had been doing that for some time, couldn't quite get that pace. Those folks definitely made some mistakes, and they cut things off when they start to see that it doesn't work, which again is somewhat different than many other parts of the government. But it led to an efficient use of resources to make sure that it was going to the highest value or highest potential value. And so that was super interesting to watch. I think on the again, this isn't, some would say this is fast and some would say it isn't, but I also think in the recent rounds of legislation that have passed in DC in the last year, even though many of those bills were in the works for quite some time, they actually came into law in relatively short order, you know? And so, for example, this CHIPS and Science Act, which is really an R&D focused effort, you know, was sort of, pieces of it were in the works for quite some time, but the ability to get a bipartisan group of people to agree, particularly in a town that is fairly toxic in terms of the political dynamic right now, to agree that that is an area where we were going to put a bunch of resources at that scale was a pretty big bet. And I think, you know, some of those areas we may decide we put too much money in or not enough into, but it was helpful to watch policymakers make a leap there.
Mm-hmm. And that model probably is only successful or only viable in places like the United States or the EU, where we have these large universities and funded labs and things like that to kind of do this work in a quick scale, right?
Certainly on the work that CHIPS and Science was putting into place, that's absolutely right. There aren't actually innovation ecosystems in many parts of the world that there are in the US and Europe.
Yeah. So let's turn our attention to those two places. So oftentimes people will compare the United States approach to decarbonization to the EU and vice versa. And sometimes we look great and sometimes we don't look so well. So what could we learn from our EU counterparts, and maybe what are we doing really well compared to the EU?
Yeah, I mean, they start from wildly different places, right? I mean, the EU is a place that has, for decades now, really built a regulatory approach to tackling climate in a way that very few other geographies have. So there are big books of policy and regulation that exist across the European Union that some would say are super, you know, constrictive. But they're not lacking for standards and regulations that guide and sort of shape the market on what kinds of solutions are going to be possible. And in many ways, that paired with a price on carbon and a trading system for emissions that they've had in place for some time incentivizes a lot of kind of creativity in the market based on those signals that the policy system is sending. However, what Europe is not great at is, despite my comment just a minute ago about both of these, the US and Europe having really strong innovation ecosystems, this country has one way more powerful and deep than even Europe does. And so the ability to take the stuff coming out of labs and universities in Europe and to commercialize that on the early side of scaling is just not the same as it is here, right? So I manage a team of people doing policy and commercialization work both in the US and in Europe. And my team in Brussels will say, look, we have no shortage of public money coming from the European Commission and the member states towards these challenges, but we do not have the muscle built to take those pots of money and turn them into small startups across Europe. It just is not proven to be as successful as the innovation ecosystem and the startup culture that exists here, including in places like Knoxville, around places that can build that up around national labs and university centers. And so what we have done better is to take a little bit of that ARPA-E model and take federal policy, yes, and some federal money, and match that with a bunch of private capital and private incentives that pull that forward way quicker than we often see in Europe. So when we interact with policymakers in Europe, they're super hungry for us to help them, frankly, break some glass on how do we do this different so that we're not just putting standards out there and big pockets of public money, but instead trying to figure out how people will access that and build companies at home.
So it's interesting, you talked about the innovation kind of ecosystem that we have here in Knoxville. And one area that we've been partnering with Oak Ridge quite a bit on, at least here at the Baker Center, has been in this area of rare earth elements and critical materials. And so we've seen, of course, that a lot of these new transitions to new technologies are shifting our focus onto resources that we weren't thinking about several years ago. Yep. That is creating supply chain issues. And so talk a little bit about what is the role of public policy, the federal government, in shoring up those supply chains versus leaving it to private industry? I mean, if the Nissans of the world or the Fords of the world need to get these rare earth elements to build batteries and whatnot, is that their responsibility, or is the federal government needed to step in and do that? And of course, working with our European partners, of course, to kind of shore up those supply chains.
Yeah, it's supply chain is something many people didn't talk about and think about until, or in the general public, until COVID happened, and then everything was affected by supply chains, and everyone became an expert in supply chains. But when you talk about, critical minerals, that's obviously one part of it. But when you think about this innovation arc to take emerging technology from a lab or a university and get it to scale, when you break that down, there is a critical minerals piece of this. But then there's all the other sort of obstacles that can get in the way of those technologies either flourishing or getting stuck. So equipment manufacturing and finance, engineering and procurement, thinking about who the off-takers are going to be for these. There's all these elements that together make up supply chain, and the minerals piece is one that, particularly now as we're trying to build these industries here at home, is getting a lot of focus for good reason. In terms of whose job that is, I think it's a shared burden, to be fair, right? The companies that have footprints around the world have a role to play, I think, in terms of incentivizing where we're going to take those resources and distribute them to the places that can actually build these markets and these industries. What's challenging, as you rightly said, is that in some places, the minerals that we most need are in places that, for geopolitical reasons, aren't to our advantage to be accessing them right now, right? So whether that is in Russia or in China, or for things like cobalt that are mostly in places like the DRC and Africa, those are complicated places for a startup or even a larger company in the US to imagine that is a reliable source for some period of time as an input into their production. And so the government can play a role in terms of trying to, I think, kind of moderate some of that risk and to build some partnerships with allies who share our values and who are also trying to build some of those markets. The Inflation Reduction Act that just came into being last year does try to incentivize that, both in terms of thinking about allies who we can partner with to access some of those, but also to incentivize onshoring of some of that capacity that just hasn't happened. So, the IRA has a bunch of tax credit schemes in place that try to make the economics pencil out in a better way for a lot of these emerging technologies. And they've put a domestic content provision in there that says if you're able to produce these things here at home, you get a little extra. That sounds great in theory, and maybe over time that will work out in the right way. The challenge is, in many places, we're starting from zero because we have not really built those systems here at home. And so it does incentivize, and there's a role for government in that sense to sort of kickstart some of those. But it is not an easy task when we're sort of starting at a deficit on that.
Yeah, and that seems especially a place where breakthrough could potentially be helpful, right? I mean, part of what you all talk about is sort of we want to seed these new technologies, but then what you described earlier today when we were chatting was that one thing you want to do is you want to help get those things to market, right? And with a lot of these technologies, there's probably some firms biting around the edges of working in these areas, but I would imagine in this particular area, there's lots of people that want to get in, but they aren't getting in for various other reasons. They're worried about competition from abroad that may be stacked against them to some extent, right? So talk to me a little bit about how maybe Breakthrough works to try to shore up that domestic production, to try to think about breaking those sort of stronger market shares that other countries might have. Is that something that you all think about at all?
Yeah, we don't probably frame it in exactly that way, in the sense that we are trying to build these emerging technologies wherever they can flourish, right? I mean, we're not, we do end up having a lot of that work happen here in the US and in Europe. And yet we have sort of a global remit to say, look, if we can find a thriving hydrogen market somewhere in Southeast Asia, we should try to make that happen. If that can happen in Australia, that's a good thing for the world. If it can happen somewhere in South America, that's a good thing. What we are doing right now is, and I briefly touched on this, but just to be clear, we support folks at the very, very early stage of the innovation cycle around these emerging technologies, meaning people coming out of labs and universities whose ideas are not yet ready to be invested in a commercial kind of private capital sort of way. We give them some R&D money and connections back to others who might be able to help them pull that technology through to the market. And then through our venture fund, we invest in more than 100 companies across the kind of highest emitting sectors whose technologies can help us get to a decarbonized future. And then on the back end of that, we also bring a mix of both private capital and philanthropic money to de-risk the sort of engineering side of things as those startups are trying to build their first commercial project. And so right now, our focus has largely been in North America and Europe for one main reason. Not so much of the supply chain reasons that we were just talking about, but more around the innovation ecosystems that I was talking about earlier, in the sense that for the vast majority of our portfolio, whose technologies today are more expensive than their fossil alternatives, we know that in order for those technologies to scale across the world, that cost difference between how much they cost today and what their fossil alternative is, something we call the green premium, that thing has to get close to zero for these things to be competitive and to scale. And because of the innovation ecosystems and the both public and private capital going into those markets in the US and in Europe, we think those are the markets where we should be focusing our time today to try to reduce those green premiums so that we can export those technologies and those solutions around the world, where emissions are high, where we know we need to shrink that gap, but where we don't want to put the burden of that cost difference on a bunch of emerging economies who probably aren't going to be able to subsidize those things in the ways that European governments and North American governments are. So,
yeah, no, I like how you put that in terms of de-risking things, right? But it's more the technological risk and the economic risk than it is sort of a geopolitical security type of risk.
That is right. The challenge right now, just to get back to the geopolitical risk, though, is that in order to, let's take manufacturing as an example, right? Steel and cement, which are just huge contributors to the emissions profile around the world. We have steel and cement companies in our portfolio that are, taking on some technology risk at this point to try to prove that they've got a new solution that maybe is different chemistry or something else than others on the market. Eventually, they'll have proven that technology and sort of reduce that risk. They'll have some engineering risk about going to build their first cement plant or their first steel facility. And we're open to them doing that wherever they can make that work, right? Based on policy incentives that make that conducive, based on market conditions. And yet from a sort of global decarbonization perspective, a place like China, which is building more than any other economy right now, we need them to be adopting green steel and green cement solutions sooner rather than later, right? And yet today, for a whole bunch of geopolitical reasons, none of these startups are thinking about their market in China because that just doesn't look fruitful or likely in the short term. So we are focused on both the technology risk and the economic risk today. But as these companies mature and as these technologies mature and get de-risked, they'll very much be thinking about the geopolitical realities in which they need to play.
So for years, when I teach my environmental economics class, I tell the students that the two main sectors we're worried about for greenhouse gas emissions are transportation and electric utilities. And growing up here in the Valley, that was the electric utility piece and the transportation piece was sort of in your face all the time. We have major interstates that run through town, presence of TVA. How are we doing on those two fronts? Are we improving on those two areas? Those were usually the places where we thought we needed to tackle first. And then if we are improving, where should we be turning our attention when we talk about decarbonizing our economy?
Yeah. It's a kind of a complicated answer, to be honest. I mean, those two areas are the places that this country tackled first. And so on many fronts, we have made the most progress there, not surprisingly, right? We've been at it for a few decades. When you think about the power sector, right, in terms of generation of that power or that electricity, in terms of storage of that power and that electricity, and in transmitting it to the places that need it to be used, on the innovation side of things, and on the market side of things and policy, we've done a lot in this country to move the needle. And the cost of many of those sort of decarbonization solutions have dramatically come down from where they were years ago. The place that I think is still most vulnerable when it comes to the power sector is our transmission and grid system in this country, which as we think about electrifying so much of the economy to get to a decarbonized future, the load that is going to put on the grid, which is a super outdated set of infrastructure, cannot be overstated. Like many people talk about needing to double or triple the amount of electricity that we're moving through the transmission system in this country. And to just be totally frank, the current system cannot absorb that. And so, we have done some work to move that forward, but even in the policy landscape, when you look at these bills that passed last year, which did a lot of good when it comes to the clean energy future, neither of them really did much on the transmission front compared to some of these other sectors. So anyway, there's a lot of progress on the power sector, and that is the sort of weakest link that has me most worried. On the transportation side, I think the place where obviously we've done the most is on the electric vehicles side of things. And again, both from a cost perspective and the market, in the last 10, 15 years, that has dramatically shifted. When we think about transportation at Breakthrough Energy, we do think about electrification as part of that. And then we think about all of the other modes of transportation that are unlikely to be electrified. And so thinking about liquid fuel solutions for those modes of transportation that are decarbonized. And what does that look like? How is that going to work for things like maritime and aviation and some other long haul trucking and that kind of thing. And so I would say in that area, we've made less progress than we have on the electrification, like the EV side of things. There's a lot of folks working on it. We have a number of portfolio companies in that space that are trying to make progress there, as do plenty of other investors. But we have some real work to do. But in terms of your question, those two sectors make up about half of the emissions in the US, right? So even if we had done that perfectly, we would only be half there. And so we end up spending a lot of our time at Breakthrough Energy talking about the other half, just to draw attention to the fact that there are a set of solutions that are still not fully baked that we know we need, whether that's in the manufacturing side of things, and again, that's everything from steel and cement and plastics and all of that, to buildings or to agriculture, right? Those three sectors make up the other half. And while there's been progress made, we have a lot more work to do.
So can you share with us what you think is a really exciting thing that you all are working in that space that's going to decarbonize one of those sectors or one of those pieces of the pie that we don't typically think about?
I mean, we spend a lot of time. My boss, I don't know if I said this at the top, Breakthrough Energy was founded by Bill Gates, and he and a bunch of other high net worth folks have put resources into Breakthrough Energy in order to be able to capitalize the different pots of money that I was just talking about. Bill talks a lot in the book that he wrote on climate, and as he continues to talk about this challenge, about steel and cement. That really, at the end of the day, when people will say we're making great progress, he'll say, "What is your answer to steel?" Right? And the truth is that is we have made less progress globally on that than we have in some of these other sectors, because it's super hard. It's a big challenge, and we are getting. We feel really good about a set of portfolio companies that we have who are doing some super innovative stuff in that space, with different chemistries and different processing systems that could really make efficient and much cleaner the way that you make steel, which has been around for a long time in its old way of doing things. And so you've got a lot of movement to make there. But what's not even harder, I mean, it's hard to sort of figure out that technology. It's also very hard to break the incumbency of the sectors that have been doing it that way for 100 years, right? And so thinking about how you're aligning the supply of that innovation with the demand from automakers and shipbuilders and everyone else who will use that steel. We spend a lot of time, both in Europe and the US, thinking about matchmaking between those on the supply side and the demand side, and using policy to really incentivize how that dynamic looks today and how we think it should look down the road.
So what's the answer there? Is it clean? Are we going to have clean steel and clean cement, or is there going to be some other technology, a new material that's going to come in and take the place of those things? If you're looking into your crystal ball, without giving away too many trade secrets, right? What do you think?
Look, I think we're going to have steel and cement in this world, right, for a long time. And our idea, and sure, there will be other solutions that'll look creative and novel that solve what those two things solve for, that maybe none of us in this room could imagine today. But there will continue to be a massive need for cement, and so our focus is, let's make that as clean as we possibly can. And that involves, again, a whole bunch of sort of reprocessing. It involves new chemistries. It involves a whole bunch of things related to heat that is required to make those products. But yes, we're focused very much on clean steel and clean cement, knowing that there will be other innovations that come in around that.
So I want to turn attention a little more directly onto policy. So the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, they're both really made to sort of speed up and hasten this transition to clean energy, or at least they have components in them that are designed to do that. So what do you like about those approaches that are embedded in there? And we already talked about some of them about domestic requirements that go into building batteries and things, but what do you like about some of those pieces and what do you wish they had done differently? Especially from your perspective where you're trying to think about de-risking, right? You're
Yeah.
sort of trying to play the role of the government if they've not de-risked these things enough. So you
Yeah.
would seem to have a unique perspective on this.
Yeah, I would add the CHIPS and Science bill to that.
Right.
Those three bills together sort of perfectly match the innovation arc that we have sort of built at Breakthrough Energy, which is CHIPS and Science is very focused on this very early stage side of things, saying no matter where we are in progress in some of these sectors, we will continue to need robust R&D flowing into all parts of the innovation ecosystem. And so that infusion of dollars, the recognition that we need to continue to bet on those technology lanes, and that we need to position the U.S. as a leader and not cede that ground to others on the early stage R&D, super important. I love that we were able to have a bill passed that reinforces that. And again, in a very bipartisan way. The infrastructure law, same. I feel like we, in this country, and I'm guilty of this having been in government where we weren't able to pass an infrastructure law. The idea that we would finally put money into building things again in this country is a super important step that, despite all of the early stage R&D that might come out of a CHIPS and Science Act, if you can't build that stuff, which is never going to be fully absorbed by the private sector, a lot of those things will get stuck at labs and universities and not actually make their way to the market. And so having a piece of legislation, again, done in a bipartisan way that says, no, we want to put the U.S. At a competitive advantage to say we're going to build hydrogen hubs and we're going to build direct air capture hubs and we're going to build other places where that high capital intensive infrastructure is being constructed is a really important lever that I think for decades we just weren't able to do in this country. And then third is you can have the R&D, you can start building some first of a kind projects, but those two things, if that's all we had done, I think we would have left some on the table in the sense of being able to build industries that were durable. So great, you have some first-time money that can build a first project, but what many of those private companies are looking for is some predictability and durability that they'll be able to operate over a longer period of time. And there are lots of ways to do that. To our earlier conversation, Europe has a variety of ways that they sort of, from a policy perspective, make that more likely. In the US, we've traditionally done that through the tax code. And so for solar and wind and electric vehicles, we've had tax credits for the last, chunk of time. And what I'm really proud of about this set of legislation is that we didn't just stop there. We turned the corner to say, what are all the emerging technologies that will also need tax credits in order to not just have a demonstration project or two, but like a thriving hydrogen industry and a thriving nuclear industry. And that predictability of a 10-year tax credit scheme is what gives a lot of the private capital folks that we work with the confidence that their money alongside the public money is a good bet. So anyway, those are the good pieces about it. The part that's challenging is, to my earlier point, we haven't done a lot of this before in this country. Like some of this is relatively new. And when you do new stuff through policy, sometimes you get it right and sometimes you get it wrong. And you need to have some appetite for absorbing some of that risk. So for example, it's hard to get exactly right how much money we should be putting into demonstration projects through the infrastructure law. Congress made a bet on, or made a guess, right, on this many billions of dollars needs to go to hydrogen demonstration projects. Maybe they got that right. Maybe they put too much money in there. Maybe they didn't put enough. But it's hard to know that when you're crafting that in an environment where, again, this country hasn't really invested in infrastructure in that way, in a meaningful way for decades. So we'll see. And we need to build the capacity at some of the federal agencies to be able to deploy that money in a really good way. Same thing on the IRA side of things, where again, I think it's been a well-designed program in the sense of thinking about how to incentivize emerging technology through the tax code. But what that breeds is because we've largely dealt with clean energy incentives through the tax code, is an expectation that the Treasury Department or the IRS is going to be really smart on clean energy policy, right? Which is not their day job. And so, what's happening right now after the bills were passed last year is that the Treasury Department is writing the rules on who qualifies for what hydrogen tax credit and at what scale and for how long and for all those components. And again, getting that right in terms of, are they putting the right incentive there? Are they making that too lucrative? Are they making it, are they getting the balance right so that enough private capital flows in alongside that public money? Those are all fair questions that are not answerable immediately. And so, I think the structure of those bills is right. The execution of it is a little bit of an open question.
Mm-hmm. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that these bills are incentivizing innovative technologies, right? You guys are incentivizing innovative technologies. So is there some degree to which you are now competing with these bills? And how, maybe if so, do you think Breakthrough will have to pivot in the coming years as the federal government has gotten more involved in what was traditionally your niche, right?
Yeah, no, we're happy to have a lot of people at that party. So there's no, there really isn't competition. The truth is, we're putting a few $1 billion into that effort, which sounds like a lot on the one hand and is almost nothing on the other hand, right? So in order to do this clean energy transition across the economy, the scale of investment required is just massive. And so, to be frank, in many circles, not just in the US, the federal governments or policymakers weren't at that table bringing resources and policy incentives to drive that change. It's a welcome change to have them there doing that. And so, frankly, no, what's happening now is when we're thinking about deploying money towards a hydrogen project or a sustainable aviation fuel project or a long duration energy storage project, those things are super capital intensive. And in some ways, what's happening is traditional finance from banks and Wall Street and others is filling part of what's needed to get those projects across the finish line. Now, the federal government in this country has some money to add to that to make it pencil out a little bit better. And in most cases, even those two pots of money are not enough to get it over the finish line. And so, we and others like us can play a role in coming in alongside those folks to bring the resources that are necessary to de-risk this and to make those things pencil out. So, yeah, we don't view it as competition at all. We feel like there's lots of people that need to be at that table, and we now have more partners at that table.
So it's interesting. I hadn't thought about this, but and you may not be able to answer this, but the idea that Breakthrough is already in this area and was helping facilitate this, essentially helping with what you describe as a really big lift. Is there do you have any inkling of whether that actually helped get federal policy passed, knowing that there were these private entities out there that were trying to do this as well? Not necessarily to say that it was a match per se, but certainly recognizing that it's a heavy lift and we have private money out there doing this. Maybe that makes the federal government more likely to come and pitch in, or was it more of, you guys are already doing this, we'll step out?
No, yeah, I absolutely think that's what happened. And it wasn't just with us. There's lots of other people that are playing in that space. I think, look, having been in government, trying to think about how to put policy in place, it is a question of like, who's going to absorb that risk, right? That often is how this plays out. And that's not true just in the energy sector. It's true in lots of other parts of the world that policy tackles. But in this lane, yeah, you think about, wait, how much do I have to take on, and how much does another, right? And as we talk to people in the administration or in Congress in the lead up to all three of these bills being passed, and again, lots of other people that sit alongside us on the private sector side. I think it gave people confidence that the bets that they were making inside government were not necessarily having to be first movers, right? Like they had something to look at that at least gave them some insight into the shape of that market, the risks that were still out there, the gaps that weren't being filled with traditional finance, where the gray areas were in terms of R&D that looked, more promising or not. So I think having a window into that from both companies that were trying to start that and investors who were trying to bring capital to the table brought the temperature down a little in terms of it looking like a ripe time to put federal policy and federal money into that mix.
I think that's an important story to tell, because I'm imagining that at the end of the day, there will be plenty of people who are pointing out failed projects that were funded through the IRA or bill, and pointing them and saying that was the failure, right? You have a confirmation bias. If you want to believe that these policies shouldn't have been in place to begin with, you'll find the one project that failed and you'll focus on that, right? But pointing out that those things failed, but there were also several private equity groups that were in the same business that were investing in similar things. It's not that we made a bad bet. That story maybe it won't get told, but it probably should get told when these things start to come to pass. I wanted to switch gears a little bit because we talked about this a little bit earlier, but IRA and bill are increasingly coming into conflict with another Biden administration agenda item, which was the 30 by 30 conservation initiative, where we were going to set aside loads of areas for conservation. This sort of intersects right with what you were talking about earlier, where was these permitting conundrums. We need to build things, we need to build them very fast. The whole conservation area has typically been sort of against building things. How do we move clean energy forward and still try to reconcile these conservation goals?
It is a great question. I do not have the answer to it, but it is one of the most important things for policymakers to get right in the near future. We again partly have not, as a country, from a federal policy perspective, put an emphasis on building things in the clean energy sector for quite some time, right? That is why there was a need for this bipartisan infrastructure law. And so we don't have quite the muscle built to do that very well. On the other hand, even when we had room to build stuff, running room to build stuff, it took a long, long time to build it. And so there's a reality check that the promise, even those who are very much behind the intent of the IRA, there's an acknowledgement that the promise of what's in that legislation won't be met if we can't build the things that we need to build to make good on that. The reality is that permitting and siting has been a challenge for years. I ran an office in the White House that was charged with trying to coordinate some of that across the federal government. And we need to figure out, I think you're sort of hearing now in the debate in Washington, a pretty clear consensus among super conservative voices to super progressive voices that we need something to change on that. Because even those who are trying to say we must get to a net zero future, they are realizing that we need to build a bunch of stuff and it can't take 20 years to do that. So where you draw the line on that and how you find that balance will take, frankly, a lot of diplomacy. It will take a lot of people listening to each other and not talking past each other. And it will take some creative policy making to thread a needle that brings enough people along. The conservation community is one side of that, right? Which is a general instinct to conserve and preserve areas for habitat and biodiversity and those things, and kind of forcing that community into a conversation about the places that are most appropriate for that conservation and the places that are most appropriate for some of the building to meet some of these climate and clean energy goals. And that takes a lot of nuance. It takes a lot of, again, listening, something that's not like the best thing that Washington, D.C. does. and some patience to kind of work through that. And yet, to your point, we don't have a lot of time to sort that out. So there's a lot of focus in Washington right now on how you thread that needle. And there's lots of, I think, frankly, really good players on all sides of the political dynamic that are trying to come up with something that's durable. Because what we don't need in this instance, we had this conversation earlier today, what the private sector does not need is for that answer to volley back and forth for the next 10 years. It really needs some certainty that we've worked out a permitting and siting solution that gives them confidence that they're going to build those projects. They're going to hire people into their companies. They're going to continue to pursue these emerging technologies in a way that let them be more durable. And permitting and siting, in addition to supply chain and some of these other constraints, are what's hanging out there often to kind of keep them on the sidelines. So we need to solve that.
Yeah, and I feel like this is an area where these two groups have not had to communicate that much in the past. I mean, we were in a town hall forum where there was discussion about putting in a new transmission line, and there was a conservation group that was against it because it was going to allow a wind project to go into an area that they didn't want because of bird migration habitats, right? And they were pointing out all these other places that had already built wind in bird migration habitats and talking about how terrible that was. And then the wind developer was there and pointing out that, well, I didn't really want to build this wind facility here either, but I had to build it here because this is where the transmission line is, right? And so it was even watching in just that one town hall meeting where they were talking back and forth is that they were clearly hadn't talked about these issues quite so much, but hopefully these types of things will get, as you said, not talking past one another, but trying to figure out what the solutions are.
I think that's right, and I think we talked about this a little earlier today as well. Transmission in this country used to be an issue largely of in-state transmission lines, moving power from one part of a state to another, because of a whole bunch of the financial incentives that exist for utilities and others around how they build those lines and those facilities. What's happening now in this clean energy economy is where a lot of that clean energy might be generated or produced needs to move maybe halfway across the country or all the way across the country or from offshore onshore, anyway. And it's much more complicated and it's much longer distance. And that provokes a set of conversations that I think didn't need to have happened before. They sort of poke at some things that have been sleeping for a while that will need to come out. Mm-hmm.
So for climate change and decarbonization goals, we often think about, by default, we think about federal legislation. Increasingly, we see leadership being taken on climate at the state level. So can you talk to me a little bit about that tension between the federal first mover, states moving first? How does that play out? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I know often people will talk about the states being sort of laboratories of ideas, right? And then on the other hand, you have lots of different states doing different things. It can be very confusing and very problematic. How do you see that dichotomy between states taking the lead, federal government taking the lead? How's that playing out on climate and decarbonization more specifically?
It happens both in the U.S. and it happens in a lot of other markets as well, where the federal government versus state or provincial governments, are often sending slightly different messages. In an ideal world, what you would have is a federal government that, to our earlier point, puts some policy in place that's fairly durable, that people can sort of see out, 5-10 years. And you allow state governments to sort of nest some of their work underneath that. That is not how that plays out most often, mostly because the federal government has not created something super durable in that, right? Like we have gone 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, step forward. And so that gives states, and the private sector not a lot of confidence that they can see that road ahead of them. What's been happening because of that or alongside that is that some states have really stepped forward to say, well, then I'm going to lead, right? I can figure out how to do that. I can figure out how to build that market here. I can figure out how to create the policy incentives that are necessary. when we think about the innovation arc that I was talking about earlier, there are some things that state government can be really good at, and there's some, just like the federal government, some areas that isn't necessarily their strength. I think about the early stage R&D side of things as something that is way more appropriate and in the wheelhouse of the federal government with the size and scale of resources and the national lab system that can infuse that early stage R&D in ways that, frankly, very few states, even the largest states, California, New York, and others, aren't really able to do that effectively. When you think about building markets and commercializing some of the stuff that comes out of that, states have a real opportunity there and can kind of be competing with each other to be first markets for a lot of these technologies. So I think what you're seeing now, partly because of some of the incentives that are in the IRA or the infrastructure law, but there's different states who are realizing, wait, I can be the carbon removal leader. I can be the hydrogen leader. We want to be the storage, And so we spend more time, I would say 3 years ago, I was spending, on the policy side of things, 90% of our time federal government focused. Now, I think, more than once a month, we're on a phone with some governor and their team trying to figure out, wait, help me interpret the incentives that are in these laws and the competitive advantage I have in this state. How do I leverage that? How do I think about building this market? And there's a whole bunch of policy incentives that they can create, including on the siting and permitting side of things, right? Because we talked about federal siting and permitting. Those issues exist at the state and local level as well that can, speed the path. So it's super interesting. I don't think it's a bad thing at all. I think the competition that exists among folks on that, on the kind of commercialization and scale side, is great. And we'll see sort of who is able to inch that forward. What's happening right now with the Department of Energy and the infrastructure law is they're giving money to states and regions to be hubs for these new technologies. So hydrogen hubs is a great example. And in some cases, states and regions are cooperating to go in together to be hubs for some of these. And that'll be super interesting to see as well, if that kind of cross-state collaboration actually works, or if the competition, between them wins out.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because for years, right, we were told that we were supposed to focus on solar and wind, right? It was all renewables. We're going all in on that. And now, of course, it seems we have this all of the above approach. But it certainly seems, I hadn't thought that essentially certain states are going to find certain technologies more advantageous than others. And so maybe it's easier to get them to get support at the state level, where you can find the technology that suits your particular economy and your particular setting, right?
And in a very good way, often those conversations happen without as much of the political layer that exists in DC around some of this, right? So I was on the phone, frankly, with a Republican governor and a Democratic governor together, who are thinking about the advantages in their states and some of the similarities. That does not happen enough in Washington, D.C., but it does happen sometimes in states who are thinking about economic development in a way as a driver differently than some people in D.C.
So we've got about 8 minutes. I'm sorry I've monopolized all of Mike's time. I knew I wasn't going to be able to help myself, but I wanted to open it up to the floor. Are there questions that folks in the room have for Mike about some of these topics?
Do you have this book yet? Because I grabbed one for you, in case you don't. Okay.
You weren't going to leave without a gift. So.
You can't leave without gifts from UT. It's our tradition. Anyway, thanks. And mainly what you did was strike a nerve, and I wanted to share rather than question about concrete. I just saw that the Danes are coming out with a concrete. And of course, once it's a green concrete in terms of activating the cement with green energy instead of fossil, it also sequesters carbon. So if you saw that, good.
With the excitement of hydrogen hubs coming out, and I'm a hydrogen fuel cell person myself, where do you think the line is right now with demonstration versus actual wide-scale deployment? Because DOE has really looked at economies of scale for hydrogen. There's been demonstration projects now for decades. I mean, you mentioned Australia. You've got the Germans with 2 different coalition areas trying to do that. You have China that claims to have 20,000 Class 8 trucks on the road right now. Where do you think it's got to just break and go to an actual scale of people using it?
Do you mean when or how?
Okay, when, where, how, and maybe how much, right?
I think what, look, what the infrastructure law did was give DOE, you're right that there have been demonstration projects for a long time, and yet I would argue not really hydrogen markets that have developed because of that. I mean, around that. And so the infrastructure law is meant to try to incentivize or to accelerate that, I think, in a more meaningful way. I think the amount of money that DOE has to put into these hubs, look, they're not going to, it's more money than they've had before, but it's not an endless amount of money to sprinkle that in 1,000 places, right? So in my mind, that's a really good thing in terms of forcing them to put more money into fewer places that actually allow it to do more than just, very light demonstration. I think what that will hopefully do is move a few places way quicker down the scale trajectory than they would have otherwise been able to do, and to catch up with some of these other places that are right now ahead of us on that. I think one of the things, I didn't get to talk too much about it, but one of the things we're doing on the project finance side of things is trying to bring a blend of both private capital and philanthropic capital to some of that. And to be honest, even though there have been demonstration projects on the hydrogen side of things, there's a lot more talk about hydrogen facilities than there is things getting to actual construction, right? And so it has been very informative to us to sort of see where those gaps are and what the hurdles are, frankly, outside the US. I mean, yes, in the US, but also in places around the world that have a long pipeline of projects that should get us closer to the scale you're talking about, and for a whole variety of reasons have things stuck in the way that is preventing that from happening. So anyway, my hope is that these bills, both on the demonstration money, but frankly the tax credit side of things, if Treasury can write these rules in the right way, that comes in on the back end of those demonstration dollars to build that in a more durable way.
Thanks for a great talk. You mentioned that the United States has a very deep innovation ecosystem with regards to energy technologies. You've also talked a lot about what the private sector is doing as well as what the governmental sector is doing in order to nurture this ecosystem. My question is, what should the private sector as well as the government do in order to secure and protect the innovation ecosystem from hostile powers who are engaging in industrial espionage and basically piggybacking off of the research and development that is taking place in the United States? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very timely and tricky question. I mean, I think a lot of that, I don't know if this is the focus of your question, but a lot of that conversation in Washington right now is happening almost exclusively about China, and for good reason, right? For some of those dynamics. And the U.S. government, frankly, across party lines, is trying to figure out ways to protect some of that intellectual property and the integrity of the ecosystem that I've been talking about. In some ways, the federal government can do that well, and in some cases, that's not really the thing they do best. And the private companies, I think, will need to step up and play a role there. I think what's challenging is we need to get that balance right so that we are both protecting this innovation ecosystem that we have built better than anybody else, and yet not sort of close down the possibility that we still need the application of some of these technologies sometime when the geopolitics look different to take hold in these other geographies, right? We need clean steel and clean cement, as we talked about, in China. We need China to be a place that is active on green hydrogen, on a whole bunch of these fronts that we and others are working on. And there are ways to design some of those systems that protect